So, Peter, there was a dramatic escalation between Iran and Israel over the weekend when Iran, of course, launched a direct military assault on Israel. This was historic, as you've written, the first time in the history of Israel that Iran has launched such a direct attack on the country. So, tell me what happened on Saturday.
Well, I suppose the shadow war that Iran until now has waged through its proxies like Hamas, like Hezbollah, like the Houthi rebels in Yemen, broke out of the shadows and became a direct assault from the Islamic Republic of Iran on Israel. It was in retaliation, of course, to an Israeli strike because the Israelis on April 1 fired cruise missiles at a diplomatic compound that the Iranians own and is actually their sovereign territory under diplomatic convention in Syria. And the Iranians declared that to be an attack on their sovereign territory, which required an escalation. And then they stepped across the red line rather than just asking the Houthis or Hezbollah to do their work for them. They've done it themselves.
And so, I guess the big question everyone's asking now, of course, is has this sparked a larger regional war in the area, or is it about to? I mean, you and I have spoken about the war between Gaza and Israel on this podcast several times, and it's always sort of been the sword, if you will, dangling over this conflict. You know, is Iran going to get directly involved? So, and of course, they've been sworn enemies for decades. So, is this a larger regional conflict now?
Not yet. It could easily become so depending on what Israel decides to do, what Benjamin Netanyahu decides to do. And he has quite a dilemma in choosing his course, but it hasn't become a regional war yet. First, because Iran actually showed some constraint, some restraint in the way it attacked Israel. It might not feel like that if you're in Israel, but first it gave notice to the countries around it. It limited the nature and scale of the attack. It was a pretty serious attack, but it was limited and it was cautious, and it was over in one evening, one night, and they declared that to be the end of their intended attack and said that they had no further intentions to launch any hostilities against Israel. So I would categorize it as a calibrated, fairly cautious attack on Israel. The reason is Iran does not want to have a full-on war with Israel. Iran is not ready for it, and they don't think they would win. Not only is Iran suffering under many years of economic sanctions, which have put them in a weakened condition, their nuclear capability is not yet ready. It's close, but not ready. They don't think they could outmatch Israel, and you would have to presume the US would also assist Israel and maybe other allies as well. Iran just is not up for that. So they didn't want to provoke a war, and they still don't want a war. So it's now entirely up to Benjamin Netanyahu, and then we'll see what he does.
And I'm just wondering, though, do you think this was something of a shock for Israel? I've seen it said that Israel has long had the assumption that Iran would always be deterred from any sort of direct attack because, like you say, Israel has a much greater military arsenal. And like you've also written, Iran is not yet, doesn't quite have the capability to actually launch nuclear weapons yet. It's sort of well on its way to developing them. So do you think this has sort of changed the thinking, I guess, perhaps, of whatever the perception of vulnerability there is within Israel?
Yes, it has certainly. It was a red line that Iran hadn't crossed. Now they've crossed it. So that demonstrates murderous intent from Iran against Israel. Nobody can doubt that any longer. Before they were hiding behind their proxies, but this is now open murderous attack on Israel itself, even though it was largely ineffectual. But we can talk about that. And yes, it does now make Iran a more immediate and obvious target for an outlet for Israeli military strike, and it gives Israel, should Netanyahu choose to take it, a license now to attack Iran.
Well, I really wanted to go into this with you because it's something you've written about at length, really. And as you've written, it's actually not just a threat to Israel, but it's actually an invitation for Israel to address its deepest fear. So can you walk me through this? what's this about, and how could this play into how Benjamin Netanyahu might calculate how he's going to respond?
Yeah. So he does have this opportunity, and although on the one hand he's got his allies all lining up to say, please don't escalate this any further, this is a very tempting opportunity for Israel. Israel considers Iran to be its greatest threat, its existential threat. The Iranians have been working on, well, they started on experimenting with nuclear capability in the 1950s when, pre the revolution, when the Shah was being helped by the Americans actually to develop a peaceful nuclear electric power capability. Then some couple of decades ago, it emerged unmistakably that Iran was actually under the Ayatollahs trying to develop a nuclear bomb. Ever since then, this has been Israel's greatest fear, that one day the Ayatollahs would develop a deliverable nuclear warhead and throw it at Israel. And Israel is a tiny country. You can fly across it in a helicopter in 15 minutes. I mean, it is a tiny place. A line that Kim Beazley, when he was former Australian Defence Minister, used to use was, he said, Israel has the strategic depth of a seaside suburb.
It does, yeah.
Yeah, so a nuclear warhead or more falling into Israel obviously would absolutely be cataclysmic, wipe out perhaps the entire population. So this has been Israel's greatest fear. And despite all the back and forth, the Iranians are back on the job. They have, we know from the inspections in February by the International Atomic Energy Agency, which is a UN agency, that the Iranians do have a stockpile of enriched uranium, U-235, at about 60% purity, which is not weapons grade, but it's close to weapons grade and easily upgradable, of about 120 kilos, which is enough to make at least a few nuclear bombs. However, they lack the warhead capability and know-how at the moment to deliver those into Israel. So the point there is really, Samantha, that the Iranians are close but not yet fully there. Israel has a little time, but this is an opportunity now. The Iranians have presented Israel with an opportunity to strike at their nuclear infrastructure and retard their program. Probably can't wipe it out completely because much of it is buried deep under mountains, but at least retard some of its nuclear infrastructure and stop its nuclear program going ahead. That is a very tempting target. It would probably win, well, based on past opinion polling, in less dire circumstances, the Israeli people have been in favour of a strike by Israel on Iran and its nuclear capability. So you'd have to presume that the Israeli public would welcome it. It would certainly allow Netanyahu to extend his grip on power, which, I mean, as is well established, the Israeli public wants him to go, and as soon as he finishes this fighting in Gaza, he wouldn't have an excuse to hang around any longer. But this would allow him to extend his term potentially, so that's a domestic political factor weighing in with the strategic as well, pointing in the same direction really, which is an encouragement for him to order an Israeli airstrike on some of the infrastructure of the Iranian nuclear program.
And tell me, how much do you think domestic politics might weigh into Netanyahu's calculations? Because I think it's probably not an exaggeration to say much of the world is probably holding its breath now and wondering how he's going to respond. And like you say, he is at peak unpopularity, I think it's safe to say. I mean, there's been protests within Israel to get him to go. Even within the United States, there's been some very senior politicians who, well, certainly U.S. Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer called for him to step down last month. So how much do you think this could sway Netanyahu to respond very strongly?
Well, yeah, the last opinion poll I saw out of Israel, he had an approval rating of 17%, 1-7. His main rival and competitor is also a member of his war cabinet, Benny Gantz. Benny Gantz this month, even though he's a member of the war cabinet of Netanyahu's, went public and said that Netanyahu should call early elections. And most of the Israeli public support that idea, something like 70% of the public, according to the last poll I saw, support early elections. In other words, get rid of Netanyahu. So he's got that factor weighing on him, and he knows his days are numbered. He is extraordinarily adept as a political survivor, as we've seen. He's moved from one coalition to another, one circumstance to another. On the other side of political power for him, of course, are potential prosecutions in 3 separate cases of corruption and fraud. So that's got to be weighing on him as well. And that's, I'm sure, helped motivate him to negotiate power, and including in this rather tenuous coalition he's got at the moment, where he's dependent on extreme right-wingers, one of whom, so the extreme right-wingers in his cabinet want him to prosecute an attack on Iran with all possible energy. I'd have to quote Itamar Ben-Gvir, his national security minister, who said yesterday, I think, he said, the boss, meaning Netanyahu, the boss must go nuts in responding to Iran. Now, I don't know if you'd want to go to a bloke who says things like that for your strategic advice or even life advice. The boss must go nuts, but that conveys the sentiment in the right-wing elements of his coalition. So if he wants, so he knows he'll have their support. He knows he'll probably have broad popular support if he wages a strike on Iran. So that's all lining up. What he doesn't have is support from his great sponsor and supporter and Israel's most important ally, the US, nor the other allies, the Western allies at least, who participated in the air defense of Israel. Britain, France, and the US have all said publicly, please, Netanyahu, do not strike Iran, do not risk escalating this into a regional war.
And so tell me about that, because we know that Israel's allies, as you've written, were key in Israel being largely undamaged by this assault from Iran, that the allies were instrumental in helping shoot those drones and missiles down. So how persuasive do you think these voices from around the globe who are urging Israel to sort of hold the line, how persuasive do you think they might be?
Well, you would think that they would be pretty persuasive. Essentially, Israel emerged as bulletproof after this attack. The Israeli military said 99% of the 300-plus munitions flung at it were intercepted or failed. So that rendered, that high intercept rate rendered Israel effectively bulletproof. Very minor damage, one person, one child injured, but nobody killed. Remarkable. But that couldn't have happened. So the US has said that it shot down at least 80 of the armed drones that Iran sent and at least 6 of the ballistic missiles that Iran fired at Israel. But we also know that the French, the Brits were also participating, as well as some of the Sunni Arab nations that neighbour Israel. Jordan opened its airspace. The Saudis helped with radar, tracking, and intelligence. This is a really important coalition that came to the defence of Israel. Now, the Saudis mightn't be too upset at all if Israel were to attack Iran, because they also, their share, they loathe the Iranians and consider the Iranians to be the Saudis' main enemy. But the Americans, the British, the French, this is a vital coalition that Israel depends on and will depend on for many years, presumably, for its security. It would be reckless, it would be wanton to burn the goodwill and the support that those governments have given him. But as we've seen with Netanyahu's conduct in the war in Gaza, he has ignored, to the point of being contemptuous to Joe Biden and American pleas for restraint, American pleas to increase humanitarian aid to the Palestinians, American pleas to negotiate a ceasefire. He's ignored all of that and just barged ahead. So it's entirely plausible, it's entirely imaginable that he will continue to ignore the pleas of his allies, even though it's now at least 3 of them, the Brits and the French as well as the Americans, plough ahead and strike Iran. So that's the dilemma for him. But if you look at his past behaviour, it probably won't be too much of a dilemma. He will probably go ahead and attack Iran. And hope that the Iranians don't reply with a full-scale response. Because remember, the Iranians, apart from their own capability, they control Hezbollah, they control Hamas, and even though Hamas is a bit degraded at the moment, they're still a force. They also control the Houthi rebels. Now, here's the big fear for all the non-Israeli governments. the Iranians are the world's, they produce 4 million barrels of oil a day, which is 5% of the global oil output. Now, if there are interruptions to the Iranian oil supply, the price of oil internationally will hit the roof. It's already elevated on the Brent crude, which is an international market price, $90 US a barrel. That's already elevated because of the underlying risk involved in the Hamas-Gaza war. If oil hits the roof, all of the efforts around the world to bring inflation down, all those central banks have been raising interest rates for the last year and a bit, all of that progress is undone. And central banks around the world have to consider putting rates up again. Financial markets would collapse. Stock markets around the world would collapse. Yeah. Joe Biden's heading to an election in 7 months. Do you think he wants an inflationary resurgence and the collapse of the American stock market? Do you think the Brits, the French, do you think anybody wants that? No, absolutely not. So that's the scenario they confront. If Netanyahu strikes Iran, and the Iranians have their oil facilities damaged or supply interrupted. And this is where the Houthi rebels come in, because they operate under Iran's control, or at least guidance. And the Houthi rebels out of Yemen are the ones who've caused trouble with shipping in the Red Sea already. If they step up their harassment in the Red Sea of international shipping to real havoc, then you're going to see a lot more disruption to international commerce. 12% of all global commerce goes through the Red Sea. So this is the scenario, and this is why you got Washington, Paris, London all saying, Netanyahu, don't do it.
Okay, but let's just go down that path. Let's just say he does. You've said it's definitely a possibility. What would a full-scale war actually look like, both in terms of what each side has in terms of military capability, and also, I guess, in terms of, who would come to the defense of Israel? Because obviously the United States is Israel's most powerful ally, has obviously stood by Israel really unwaveringly, despite some sort of cautions for restraint. And my understanding is that the United States was not happy about this attack, and that it wasn't warned beforehand, or perhaps it was warned 5 minutes beforehand, and that it's then sort of reassured Iran, like, we weren't behind this. So tell me how this would play out.
Yeah. Well, the Americans have complained that the Iranians didn't warn them, but it didn't matter because they warned the Saudis, they warned the Jordanians, the Egyptians, the UAE, and they in turn passed on the information immediately to the Americans. Apart from which the Americans read all their mail anyway. Let's be honest.
Yes.
So the Americans are really just bleating out of political positioning.
Would the United States actually back Israel? Because it has said it will not. It has said it will not back Israel should it retaliate, and that it does not want to it doesn't want to be involved in some full-scale war in the Middle East. And like you say, Joe Biden's got an election in 7 months. He's obviously faced huge criticism internally in the United States for his support with the war in Gaza already. So where would this leave Israel, realistically?
Well, you're right. The Americans have said that if Israel chooses to attack Iran, that the US will not support that attack. They have not said, though, that they would then step back from any defense of Israel. It's very likely that the US, whether it's, certainly under Biden, Trump is a whole different story. We can talk about that if you want. But certainly under Biden, it's very likely the US would defend Israel under any circumstances against an Iranian attack. The Brits and the French probably, but you can't be sure. And what would the capability look like? Well, the Iranians have a sophisticated air force, mainly Russian, which they would fly directly at Israel. If it were a full-on war, they would use all of they used a fraction of their missile and drone capability. They have a vastly bigger that they could deploy, plus activating their proxies. If Hezbollah started firing, they're estimated to have 1 million missiles at Israel. You can just picture what that would look like.
And Peter, you've mentioned earlier that Iran does not want a full-scale war with Israel, that wasn't its goal here with the attack that it launched over the weekend. So what did it actually want? If it wasn't to provoke a serious, wider regional conflict here, and like you say, the country gave warning, and it was somewhat of a measured attack in the sense that it didn't target major cities, it was targeting, military bases. So what did it actually want with this attack?
It seems that the Iranians were concerned with their credibility. that they thought if we let the Israelis attack our diplomatic compound in Syria and we don't respond, then it will affect our credibility with our military, it will affect our credibility with our enemies, and it will affect our credibility, the regime credibility internally. So they felt obliged, I think, to strike Israel, and yet they were obviously reluctant, and hence the very cautious way in which they did it.
So essentially it leaves Netanyahu, as you've written, in a very, very tricky spot. There's this temptation to respond in an incredibly extreme way, which I guess it's probably safe to say is perhaps a bit of a habit of his, certainly with the war that he's launched in Gaza. Obviously it hasn't been restrained. I mean, how tricky is this for him to wrap up?
Well, for anybody else, it would be a very difficult dilemma. For him, it might be less so because all his domestic imperatives and his past behaviour, it's very, very important to look at his past behaviour, indicate that he will do what suits him politically and not his allies.
Well, thank you so much, Peter, for your time.
Pleasure, Samantha.